All right. Well, welcome to Horde's Dairyman Dairy Livestream. I'm your host, Corey Geiger, managing editor of Horde's Dairyman. We have an exciting episode planned for this week as we work through navigating the pandemic economy. We always start with a shout out, and this one is very fitting shout out. USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue announced last week that the U.S. Department of Agriculture launched its Farmers to Families Food Box program and has distributed over 5 million, that's million, food boxes in support of American farmers and families affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Quoting Secretary Perdue, the Farmers to Families Food Box program was designed to put American farmers and distributors of all sizes back to work while supporting overburdened food banks, community and faith-based organizations, and other nonprofits serving Americans in need. And the program is doing just that. It's encouraging to see the passion with which farmers, distributors, and nonprofits have gone through and above and beyond to make this program work and help fellow American people. Although it's a momentous milestone, said Perdue, referring to the 5 million food boxes distributed so far, this is only the beginning of the program, and with continued support, we expect up to 40 million food boxes will be delivered through the country by June 30th. And so, to say the least, there's a lot going on in the countryside and around the world. We're going to start right away here with a poll question as a prelude to our first Dairy Livestream guest. And this is just checking how you're feeling here. Jim, put that on the screen. You can get ready to vote. When will you feel comfortable dining in a restaurant? A, right now. B, in a month or two. C, in 6 months or more. Or D, when there is a COVID-19 vaccine. In New York City and Chicago are just starting to open up. New York City is actually home to almost 8% of the bars and restaurants in America. So, I mean, we think about these cities, they are tremendous sales agents for the food we grow on our farms throughout the countrysides in America. So we're getting a very strong response here, and we do have a leading poll answer. And we will hold that as we introduce our first guest. So we have Steve Kyle with us today. He's a highly regarded Harvard-trained economist. Steve Kyle's associate professor at Cornell Charles Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management. He works in the area of macroeconomic theory. Think big picture economic scenarios involving the U.S. and the entire world. An innovative instructor, Professor Kyle has an outstanding reputation of explaining major economic events and has developed 6 new courses in his many years. I'd like to add that Steve Kyle may just bring more energy to a project than I do. Professor Kyle, let's talk about consumer confidence as an economic driver.
Well, consumer confidence is key to where we're going with all of this. Let's remember, consumer spending is something close to 70% of GDP overall. So whether consumers are in a good mood makes a huge difference as to whether they'll spend money or they won't. That poll question you put out there is indicative of my own sort of off-the-cuff view of how things are, which is people are mixed. They don't really know. I know from my own personal experience, I'm not going to a restaurant again until my wife agrees to go out on a date with me, and she's scared. She's in the camp of waiting for a vaccine. Now, I don't know that she'll stay there forevermore, but that's where she is right now. And I suspect a lot of people are wavering between several of those categories, depending what the headline of the day is. Headlines looked awful here in New York for a while. Then they looked better. Now they're talking about a second wave. I have no idea what's going to happen in 3 months. And I don't think even Mr. Fauci really knows what's going to happen in 3 months. So we're all in sort of a wait and see attitude. And that's one of the reasons I think that using business cycle language to describe what's going on and what the government policies are right now is actually a bit misguided. In a normal business cycle, quote unquote, if there is such thing, business activity starts to slow down, businesses start to lay off workers, those that are more marginally profitable go away, and when enough of that happens, you have your recession. What we had this time was an economy that was somewhere near the peak of the business cycle, doing very well, and suddenly 40 million people were told to go home. And now we are seeing a slow erosion of businesses that remain viable because, well, back to your restaurant question, my grandfather was in the restaurant business in New York City. I don't think he could have been viable at 50% capacity, or at least not for very long. Maybe a while he'd have hung on, but he'd have closed down his business if he had to do that. It wouldn't have worked. And I suspect that that's what we're seeing now, is that the erosion of businesses that typically precedes or goes along with a recession, we're seeing happening gradually now, and it's going to go on for as long as the uncertainty about the virus goes on. And it's not just restaurants that are in trouble. Anything that means lots of people gather together in an enclosed space is going to take a while, and that includes sports, that includes music concerts, that includes movies. The airlines are in a terrible state, and tourism likewise in a terrible state. And one of my fellow panelists, Professor Novakovic, reminded me before we started this that we really need to also mention state and local governments, which have been spending a lot of money that they didn't budget for, and they still have to balance their budgets. So they're going to start cutting other spending, and for states, that's mostly teachers, cops, firefighters, and the like, in a few months if they don't get some help. So we're all in a state of waiting to see what happens. I do think, though, and let me not be a total pessimist, that a lot of what we will need to reactivate the economy once people stop being nervous and willing to go out and buy things are things we have the tools to achieve. If we're looking at a situation where there's a massive lack of demand, people are unemployed, in other words, there's lots of slack in the economy, that is exactly the time when fiscal policy should be used to give the economy a bit of a boost, or more than a bit, actually, this time, and take that slack out of the economy and get things running again. Even the chair of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, not known for being a wild-eyed person in any way, said that that Congress should do this. That doesn't happen very often when you hear the guy in charge of monetary policy telling the people in charge of fiscal policy to get on with it. As far as monetary policy, Mr. Powell has done what he can. Once interest rates are at zero, hey, he's done. He can try various unorthodox programs. I'm not against them. They didn't work as well as anyone thought they might back in 2009 and 2010. I don't have a lot of confidence that they're going to do a lot now, but I'm all for using every tool at our disposal to see where we can get.
Thank you, Steve. We're going to go to another poll question before we introduce our next guest. And the poll question is this, and Jim Baltz will put that on the screen for us. What percent of USDA's budget goes towards nutrition programs? Think mostly SNAP. So your answer options are 20%, 40%, 60%, or 80%. So go ahead and vote on this one. And I think it speaks to a lot of things that are taking place on the federal level and within states and on our farms. So we're just approaching 50% of the votes here. And I want to thank my colleagues here, Maggie Gillis and Caitlin Allen. Be sure to send your questions in. You can type those in as we hear from Steve and our next two guests. So let's go ahead and close the polls here. And we'll put that up there, and you guys can take a look at that. And actually, our next guest is going to give us the right answer. And we're delighted to have USDA Chief Economist Rob Johansson with us on DairyLivestream. With 5 years of experience as America's top agricultural economist, Johansson is responsible for the department's agricultural forecast and projections and for advising USDA Secretary of Agriculture on economic implications, regulations, and legislative proposals. As our audience begins considering questions for our panel, I'd like to add that Rob has a unique background and can take questions on a variety of topics. He currently serves as chairman of the Federal Crop Insurance Corporation Board of Directors. He previously worked at USDA's Economic Research Service, the Office of Management and Budget, the Congressional Budget Office, and the White House Council of Economic Advisors. Rob, let's start out by talking about that poll question and USDA's budget.
Well, great. Thanks a lot, Corey, for inviting me. And I'm happy to be here with Dr. Kyle and Dr. Novakovic to talk with your listeners about a variety of things in the ag economy. But this is a good question to start with. It emphasizes the fact that USDA does a lot of things that people probably don't think about, particularly when we're in a crisis situation like we are right now. So the correct answer, and obviously this changes every year depending on the economy and how many people are qualifying for assistance or applying for it. But generally, my rule of thumb is about 80% of the Farm Bill budget for Farm Bill programs goes to the SNAP program, which is something that most folks don't know about. So again, it's not exactly exact numbers, but I usually think about 100 billion a year in Farm Bill program outlays, and about 80 billion of that goes to SNAP. It's a little bit lower right now. It was a little bit higher earlier when we were coming out of the Great Recession. So I don't know if that's going to be a surprise to your listeners or not, but we'll find out perhaps in the question and answer period. I was going to talk a little bit following on Dr. Kyle's points, that certainly when we are seeing the economy take such a large dramatic hit like we are right now due to coronavirus, we see a lot of expectations that GDP will be down, and there's uncertainty about how quickly that will return, both for the US as well as for the rest of the global economies. And of course, that drives our expectation of what trade will be and what prices are likely to be, because that'll push up and down food demand, whether that's meat products, dairy products, or the feed grains that supply those animals. Certainly, we've seen some fairly dramatic price swings here since January. In dairy, for example, we know that the dairy prices took quite a nosedive between January and April, and we've seen them come back a little bit more recently. But I think your question about what to expect in the fall has got a lot of uncertainty around any answer you'll get, and that may be introducing some additional volatility into some of those futures prices going out towards the end of the year. FAPRI at the University of Missouri just put out some numbers yesterday, it might have been the day before, that shows significant declines in the all milk price for 2020. They, of course, had built into their expectations the phase 1 deal with China, which had pushed up a little bit in terms of our expectation for how well the dairy sector might have been doing when they came out with their earlier estimates back in January. And certainly they've revised them a couple times now. And the most recent update shows 2020 all milk price at about $16.30 for 2020, $16.30 again for next year. So again, that's down a couple dollars a hundredweight from what we were expecting as a result of the phase 1 deal. USDA, of course, has a lot of different programs. We've been putting some in place more recently to deal with the coronavirus impacts on producers' incomes, as well as trying to facilitate the movement of dairy products as well as other products from farms to more directly from farms straight to consumers, and whether that be to food banks or through the new program that you'd mentioned that the Secretary was talking about earlier. Of course, we have the Dairy Margin Coverage Program that does provide some insurance to producers that participated. And of course, through the crop insurance program, we have the Dairy Revenue Protection Program that's available to producers that want to insure some of that risk going out into the rest of the year. Let me just talk a little bit about the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, the CFAP program, as it's called. There's a significant portion in there for dairy producers that will provide payments for a larger payment for first quarter production of milk and a smaller payment for the second quarter of production. That's somewhat related to how the program was authorized. We had money appropriated from Congress under the CARES Act that allowed us to cover a larger portion of those losses that were occurring in the first part of the year. And then the Secretary also decided to add to that CARES Act funding some additional funding from the Commodity Charter Act Corporation funding supply, the CCC available resources that we also use to supplement the CARES Act funding to provide producers a little bit more assistance with the impacts that they were facing as a result of the coronavirus. And we measured that mainly by looking at the price drop between the pre-coronavirus period and the post-coronavirus period. So for dairy, gross payments under that program are estimated at about $3.5 billion, but of course we have payment limitations and AGI eligibility that would bring that down to roughly $2.8 billion after producers go in and apply and see what they can receive under that program. And we're, of course, that's going to be implemented through the FSA county offices, and we're trying to make that implementation as easy as possible. We did base the dairy component of this program on production, not on sales. We didn't want to get into trying to calculate how much dumping had been going on or where sales were occurring and where they were not occurring. So we made it just based on production. So dairy producers will notify their county office of their production values for that first quarter and get a payment accordingly. Obviously the administration's put in place a couple other programs that dairy producers may avail themselves of that aren't through USDA. That might be through the Small Business Administration. There's some paycheck protection program available, funding available that are also available to agricultural operations, as well as some loan that the SBA is providing as well. So again, I'll just wrap up a little bit by just saying, prices have come down significantly since January, but we have seen a little bit of a return in some product prices. And actually, we are seeing pretty decent trade expected for dairy, considering all of the impacts that are going on. Dairy is one of the sectors that seems to be holding up pretty well in the trade arena, certainly not growing as much as we would like to see, with both the deal that we struck with China, but also some of the other trade agreements that we've got, whether that's the new USMCA agreement or the Japan trade agreement. But we are seeing trade hold up, hasn't been falling. So our most recent May outlook for trade shows dairy products are going to be, at least for this fiscal year, are staying similar to what we had forecast in February. So not a lot of losses there related to trade, and that would be attributed to coronavirus. Exports sitting at about $6.2 billion, mostly in dairy milk powder, are expected to, actually, I think this is compared to last year, it's up significantly from 2019. So with that, let me just stop. And I know that Dr. Novakovic has a wealth of experience on dairy as well, but I can certainly cover some of the other more general aspects of the agricultural economy, whether that's net farm income or other components of the crop insurance program as we get into the Q&A section.
Jim, we're going to go off script just a little bit. We'll put that answer to that second poll question up here so we can clearly see what our audience did there. And as he's doing that, throwing him a curveball, 39% of the audience got that answer correct. That 80% of the USDA budget, as Chief Economist Rob Johansson said, goes towards nutrition programs. So that was the correct answer to that poll question. And Rob talked about a couple things here. One of them was AGI, that's adjusted gross income. That's what that acronym stands for. And when I was just cutting my teeth in this business, I always heard about FAPRI. And I'm like, what the heck's a FAPRI? So FAPRI is the Food and Agricultural Policy Research Institute, and talk about, that's at the University of Missouri. Could you real quickly, Rob, talk about how that organization interacts with USDA and Congress for that matter?
Oh, sure. Yeah, they're a policy research center. There's a couple of these university research groups housed around the country. So there's one in Nebraska and one in Texas right now. They provide Congress with a lot of information on different policy proposals, generally Farm Bill related. The USDA has cooperative agreements with those institutes, just like we do with other universities. on issues that are pressing of the time and that the Secretary has questions about. So we interact with FAPRI pretty regularly. They have a talented group of agricultural economists there that provide good information about the FAPRI's specialty is more on the baseline, so they estimate out baseline production and government payments and farm income for the year. They update that fairly regularly, and it's a useful comparison to what USDA also puts out by way of long-term expectations of farm income, production, and growth. Texas puts out more on the farm side. They have representative farms, so we can dig into some of their farm income estimates by type of farm. And then Nebraska is focused on drought mitigation. So there's a number of these research groups around that we stay in touch with, and we help through cooperative agreements help fund some of that research, just like we have with Cornell over the years.
Thank you, Rob. We're going to go to a final poll question for today, and as Jim Baltz puts that up on the screen, which of the following was a June 2020 Class 3 futures price contract? 1752, 1356, 2056, all the above or none of the above? Go ahead and vote on this, and we will have Andy Novakovic comment on that as he joins us back on Dairy Livestream. So we'll, the audience, we got about 1/3 of the audience members have voted, and we're getting every answer category has an answer at this point. As the audience continues to vote here, I want to thank Andy for this week's program. He himself invited Steve and Rob to this week's Dairy Livestream, and I really appreciate it on behalf of the Hordes Dairyman editorial team. So let's go ahead and close the polls here. And we're going to leave that slide on the screen, Jim, here as I introduce Andy, because our audience members know Andy and I, and as regular viewers know, Andy has a long and distinguished career as an economist with Cornell University. He's also willing to make some extremely candid comments, and we'll bring this conversation a little bit back to dairy. Andy, some of the viewers might be surprised to learn that the answer to the poll question is D. All the above. Those contracts are listed in order there. That 1752 was on the CME on February 10th. On April 9th, 60 days later, it was 1356, and yesterday, 2056. So Andy, these markets are volatile, and some people would even call them violent dairy markets right now, and a lot of industries are facing this because it's so tumultuous. What's some insight that you can give after having some perspective with Steve and Rob here as to this macroeconomic, what's causing all this?
Well, let me just make a couple of comments about the numbers, and then get a little bit to sort of maybe reasons and strategies. A lot of us, I imagine, get stuff pushed into our email box every day, a little news summary of something, a dairy report or farm magazine, something. Corey is pretty good about putting stuff in my mailbox on a pretty regular basis. And I've been really struck over the last 2 years, 5 years, I don't know, it's gone on for a while, certainly not just the last couple months, where I'll look in the morning and it'll say, oh my gosh, boy, Chicago is a big hole in the ground and everything fell down and it's just awful and terrible. And then 2 days later, it's like, oh no, it's all good. In fact, it's really good. And, you look at that and you kind of have to go, what the heck is going on here? And, is the right answer somewhere in between these or what's going on? If you go and you actually look at the charts on CME prices, say for the Class 3 contract, you can see a line that shows blue bars and red bars that say this is when it went up and this is when it went down. And it looks like you're looking at, the stripes on the flag or something. It's just kind of alternating up and down, which to me is basically saying these are people who are knowledgeable about their industry. Maybe they're on the buy side, maybe they're on the sell side. They don't want prices to go bouncing around all like crazy. But what it means is they're really uncertain about what is sort of the trend in this market. And part of this, I think, goes back to something that people like Mark Stevens and I, Bob Kropp, Truman Graff, Bob Story, whatever your favorite guy was, wherever you are, talked about for ages, and that is the fact that milk prices kind of live on a knife's edge. And you push it a little bit this way with supply, or you push it a little bit this way with demand, and those prices can go all over the place. Steve Kyle would be one who could probably give you a lesson on commodity markets in general, having this kind of characteristic of being pretty sensitive to what looked like fairly small changes in production and consumption. And boy, there's going to be no year that's a better illustration of that than the first few months of 2020. If we look at the number that we're seeing now as what might be the June price, with a couple weeks of June left to go, that's a pretty stunning number, but it falls pretty well short of the record price that we saw in 2014. It matches the high prices that we saw in 2012 and 2010, but basically all it does is get us back to the trend line we were on if you kind of just shoot forward from November, December to January. So that's not a bad thing, because we expected 2020 to be good, and we're just kind of getting back to what that good might have looked like. But it begs the question, is this sustainable? Steve kind of opened that door when he talked about what is the nature of the general economic recovery. And there's all kinds of people that are resorting to various different letters of the alphabet. Is it a V shape? Is it a U shape? Is it a L shape? Is it a W shape? I don't know. Maybe it's a J shape. But I think whatever shape it is, we don't have the foggiest idea. We can have people at FAPRI say run out a few scenarios, and that's good. That's helpful. Here's the implication. But to actually say, I'm picking door number 3, that's the tough part. And I think the challenge for all dairy farmers is to really try to get their hands around the fact that you thought you had volatility before, buddy. Don't get too confident about what the next 12, 18 months are going to bring. And the last thing I'll say in that regard is to really punctuate one of the things that Steve started with. A lot of the pandemic economy is supply side stuff. You're worried about worker health, employee health. It's an infectious disease issue that has implications for production, whether you're a meat packer or you're making pickup trucks. But it's also a demand side issue, and that's really where Steve comes in with the macroeconomic effect. It's about purchasing power. It's about, do I have a job? Am I furloughed? I'm getting unemployment benefits, but it's 2 months since I applied and I still haven't gotten anything. I'm way behind on the rent, and et cetera, et cetera. And how long does it take before we can restore any kind of vigor to purchasing power? And if we don't have that, then we're going to continue to have sluggish sales, not only of dairy products, but the rest of our economy. And so in that kind of environment, what are your strategies as a dairy farmer? Locking in a price that's at $20, I would say, is a fairly easy call. If you're worried about missing it being 22, I'd say maybe you ought to worry about missing it at 16. And I think that's one part we don't often are able to get our hands around. We know if the corn's good, we know if the cows are performing well, we know if God's being kind to us on the weather, but consumer purchasing power, we don't really get up in the morning, stick our finger in the air and say, oh, it's looking pretty good. And I think that's going to be a real trick for us going forward.
And if I could add something on the volatility, it isn't just dairy. It's markets in general. My favorite example being the oil market, where they were actually paying people to take oil at one point. The price went negative, which somebody's going to write a dissertation on that one at some point soon, I'm sure. But the overall market, the stock market, is all over the place. And I think that I get the question all the time, what about the stock market? And I resolutely refuse to answer that, because I don't know. I do know that in a couple of years, we're going to be through this one way or the other. We're either going to have a vaccine, or we will have adopted a new way of existing that allows us to continue to function as a country. But in the meantime, there are going to be some massive ups and downs, and I wouldn't bet my rent on one way or the other. I would try and stick it out and be conservative, which is what I think most people are doing.
Steve, Andy talked about milk price living on knife's edge, and he referenced that you could speak a little bit more to commodity markets and how sensitive they are to movement. You want to expand on that?
Well, with all of the problems on the supply side that Andy alluded to, commodity markets in general are not doing all that well. Commodity prices are down. Inflation, the latest report was negative, which just came out. I think it was today, might have been yesterday. And everyone is waiting for some degree of certainty as to what the future may bring. Now, I can say, hey, in 2 years we'll be okay, but that's a long time from now. And we don't know. Well, let me just give one big uncertainty. I don't want to go into politics, but I don't think I'm going too far out on a limb by saying this is an election year. And it's hard to say how that's going to go or what the result will be. And that will have a strong influence on what economic policy is next year. So even from that basic factor that I would want to put into any of my prognostications, what is government policy going to be next year? I feel pretty certain in saying Jerome Powell is going to stay the course and keep monetary policy fairly loose. But fiscal policy, there's a $3 trillion bill in Congress right now that the Senate may or may not take up. And so who knows what it's going to be? And people are trading on the latest rumor of a vaccine or whatever it might be. And my advice to everyone would be, don't do that. You can't pick the highs and lows right now. It's unpredictable.
Thank you. Rob, one of the questions that came in before our broadcast was related to the payments. USDA is projected to make 2 rounds of payments under the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, or CFAP. That's if there's enough money to go around, and we're pretty early in that program, but when might USDA know if there's enough money for a second round of payments?
Yeah, so the program was established with a $16 billion limit, and there was a lot of unknowns about which sectors would come in and which sectors we didn't know about. This is for any agricultural producer of any agricultural product for the most part. We've got pretty good prices and expectations of prices, whether that's futures prices for row crops or milk. But for some commodities, we just didn't know. And so we've got a process in place right now for those sectors that we didn't have good information on to come in and apply for inclusion in the program for payments. And because we didn't know how many would come in and which sectors those might be, think about aquaculture, think about nursery crops or orchard crops, horticulture. We don't have a lot of good intel on those sectors because a lot of times they're not participating with normal USDA programs. So we don't have a good amount of data on them. So they're allowed to come in right now in this period through the end of June, essentially, to provide us with more information about their sector, and we'll make the determination on whether they're eligible for payments. I would say that after that point in time, so sometime in July, we'll know what our expected outlays are, and we'll be able to determine when we can make a complete payment. Of course, sign up, I'll point out again, sign up for this program through August, and so a lot of times producers will hold off because they're involved in on-farm operations, and they'll make it into the county offices later, closer to the end of the sign-up period. So it could be that we'll have to wait till that sign-up period is over before we make the determination on that last 20% of the program.
Thank you. Last week or 2 weeks ago, we had a discussion on, and this question came up, and I'm going to set it up here, and Andy might want to tackle it first, and Rob might want to follow up. But the simple question is, why was milk covered by forward contracting excluded from the CFAP eligibility? Now, 2 weeks ago on DairyLivestream, we had an article that came out after that said, Dracula finally dies on dairy risk and relief. And I'm going to read the quote that Jim Mulhern said. The short answer is that a producer's participation in risk management programs ranging from dairy margin coverage through dairy revenue protection livestock gross margin, hedging, and futures does not preclude one's milk coverage, he said. First quarter milk production times the payment rate is covered, but this specific question uses the words forward contracting to be excluded from CFAP. Has anything changed in the last couple weeks?
Well, that's news to me if it has. I mean, it's a simple question to follow up on, but I don't know the answer. My understanding was that, as I think Rob was probably about to say, the payment is simply based on production, and it doesn't say subtract off something.
Yeah, that's right. There's been a lot of questions about, more on the row crop side than on the dairy side, which is to be eligible, a producer has to have essentially still price risk in whatever inventory they're holding. So if they have price risk, meaning that the price wasn't set, they hadn't already sold the commodity. If they had already sold the commodity, they're not that product is not eligible for participation, since it would not have been affected by the coronavirus. So in the sense for dairy, it's I know it's been a question that's come up several times. The participation in DMC or DRP doesn't preclude you from including your dairy production as part of the program. If a producer had sold prior to January 15th some portion of their dairy production, and therefore were not, that part of their production was not subject to price risk, FSA may be taking a look at that, but I would hesitate to make a statement here without verifying with FSA on how they're going to adjudicate that.
Thank you, Rob. Let's go back to the big picture here. Steve, in his opening comments, talked about the fact that pandemic has devastated the restaurant industry, and he touched on a little bit, are there any other industries or businesses that have been critically damaged by COVID-19? And there are some.
Sure, there are a list of them, and I went briefly through some of them. Certainly sports, which is getting all of us who have to stay home. We wish there were a ball game to watch, and last year's doesn't do it, but I don't see when that's going to come back anytime soon. Similarly, large music concerts or movies, which I used to go to once a week on Fridays, that's not happening anymore. And there's really no telling when that's going to come back. Airlines are a bit better than they had been, and tourism generally, but that's from a base that was 10%, literally 10% of where they were before. So if you go down to 10% of the people you used to bring, anything better than that looks like a big percentage gain, but really they're still in very bad shape. And they're an airline which, they're an industry which has a lot of borrowed money. They also have a somewhat checkered history of what they do with government assistance. Got characterized as well, last time in 2009 and 2010, they got a lot of assistance and spent the money on stock buybacks, which wasn't a popular thing to do. A lot of these industries could come back quite quickly if the situation warranted, and by situation I mean, do people feel safe enough to leave their house for any length of time? I know that most of the people I know are planning on, if they're planning on a vacation at all, are going to drive somewhere and aren't going to go very far. That has an effect on all of those places at the beach, for example, which used to get hordes of people all summer, and they're not going to show up this time. So we will have to wait and see, but it does beg the question of, do we need more assistance? And as I mentioned at the beginning, using business cycle terminology can lead you astray. They called a lot of the payments to individuals and businesses stimulus payments, which they really weren't. They were more on in the vein of relief payments, stretched out over a period of time. The disaster that we're relieving them from is stretched out. So we aren't ready for a stimulus yet, because even if you poured money into the economy, if people aren't willing to go out and spend it, it isn't going to do much.
Corey, could I just throw in too something that I think every farmer will really relate to, and that is there's a question about how hard we get hit, which is basically a profitability question. But there's another question about how sturdy you are to take a blow, and that's a solvency question. And all of us have commented, there are times when profitability is pretty poor on the dairy farm, but the guy that doesn't have much debt, in other words, has a high degree of solvency, is able to absorb that more gracefully. And I think that absolutely the same principle applies to all of these businesses that we're talking about. And you think about the hospitality industry, you've got a range of mom and pop diners, hotels, many of which, are, it says Marriott on the front, but it's a mom and pop that might actually be operating that facility. Those folks are going to either die or hang on, depending on what their balance sheet looked like, which is a good reminder for all producers as well.
Which says that one very possible outcome of all of this is consolidation into larger businesses at the end of all this. As Andy mentioned, the ones that are going to go under are the smaller, more marginal ones. The bigger ones will remain and may well gobble up or at least take market share that the little ones used to satisfy. And I'll let Andy and Rob talk about that in the dairy industry itself, but consolidation is something that is a thing to worry about.
We have a very thoughtful question from a dairy economist that came in here, and I'm going to set it up here. The person is very articulate. USDA's activities to support the dairy industry through product purchases was important to commodity market price recoveries. Milk production reductions and aggressive exports, combined with USDA purchases, have driven cheese prices from $1 to an all-time record of $2.58.5 per pound. Current cheese price levels risk damaging commercial demand. USDA has made additional money available under several programs to make further purchases. Given product price recovery and risk to long-term commercial demand, we're talking about cheese here predominantly, will USDA wait to make further purchases, or will, for example, we started, I guess, with that shout out with the 40 million food boxes, but is there some teeter-totter or balance to this, the expenditures right now, I guess, would kind of be the question.
Well, that's a great question. A lot of times these programs, whether that's the food purchase and distribution program as part of the trade, the trade facilitation work that we did last year, or if it's the Section 32 types of purchases, or in this case, the CFAP food box purchases, they are, generally speaking, take a little bit of time to get set up and to launch. And so as prices recover, I know that there has been some recovery in the restaurant side or in the pizzeria side, and that's pushing up some domestic mozzarella prices, for example. And we are seeing recovery in some of these dairy product prices, butter and cheese. It will affect as we make decisions on future programs. But the ones that are already in place that are sort of rolling at this point are less easy to sort of slow down and change. Now, that being said, we have been trying to move more towards fluid milk purchases for some of those programs last year and into this year. And that's kind of a new thing, but it seems to be working, and we seem to be able to move those fluid milk purchases to consumers through the nutrition channels. There's been a certain amount of constraint on infrastructure necessary to do that, but I think until we see a recovery, we'll continue to have worries about not just dairy, but other sectors, and we'll continue to have them as a component of programs going forward. But certainly, if prices are recovering and have recovered to high levels, I wouldn't say there's going to be a worry about destruction of commercial demand, but I think there will be a revisitation of which products are being purchased.
Mm-hmm.
Corey, I might throw in just a little bit on that too, and maybe three things. One is timing is really difficult. I'm actually a really big fan of my friends at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and I think these are competent people that work really hard to do the best they can. but it's really hard to get all of this machinery in place. And so it's kind of like, the cows are running out of the barn, shut the door, and by the time you limp over there and shut it, all the cows are gone. You go, whoops, well. And it's not a criticism. It's just these things are difficult to do, especially when everybody's working at home and you're in a big hurry. So I don't think when any of this was being planned, USDA said, oh, hey, gosh, this might jack up the price of cheese over $2. I mean, you were worried about it going to 50 cents, not going to $2.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing that I think is, a couple of weeks ago, we had Jim Mulhern and Michael Dykes on the program. And there is two good poster children for people that bring the voice of industry to Washington and say, oh, hey, these are our concerns. And it's the vocalization of those concerns that help get us things like the Farmers to Family Food Box. And if there becomes a concern about some other aspect, they will continue to be the voice. So it's not like, USDA isn't going to be aware of a situation that industry identifies. And I guess the third thing I'll say is just going back to the other one. We are in a world that is going to be veering from the right ditch to the left ditch for the next 25 miles. And that's just the way it's going to be.
Mm-hmm.
Great analogy, Andy. An audience member just asked here, this is a local question, but I'm going to partially answer that and see if anyone wants to join in. But the specific question is, why is butter in short supply? Our local Sam's Club has not had any butter for the last 2 weeks. Now, some stores and supply chains are filled, some are not. This is kind of a triage situation here, even though we're hearing good reports. I certainly think you should send that question to your local dairy checkoff program. They've been working in the local levels to work with manufacturers and retailers to ensure that products are in the store. But does any of our panelists have anything to add in that regard?
Well, I don't know how widespread that is. I mean, you can always find someplace somewhere that's doing something. And I'm not seeing any problem with finding butter in the store, but I'm not saying that the person who made that comment is wrong either. I can say this, we're producing a heck of a pile of butter this spring. So in terms of production amounts, there's nothing holding that back. There could be some supply chain disruptions in terms of packaging because, most butter sold in the store is going to be in quarter pounds or pounds, and that is not, there's a whole lot of butter that's sold in a different package. So if you wanted to buy a 25 kilo box of butter, I'm guessing you wouldn't have a hard time finding a few of those for sale. And that might be what's going on in some particular location. But there's lots of butter around, I can tell you that much.
Well, the day you can't get butter in Wisconsin is the day I run for cover. So.
Well, let's take our airplane up to 30,000 feet. And obviously, COVID-19 has thrown regular market cycles out the window. Do we have any precedent for how national and global markets might come out of this?
Well, we were near the peak of the business cycle when this all started. In fact, I was publicly wondering whether we were at it or whether we just passed it or whether we were about to get to it, but certainly we were somewhere near it. I have been talking this hour about how we really shouldn't be using business cycle terminology for a lot of this. But having said that, the peak is in our past. We're deep down in a recession now, whatever you think the cost might be. But I think where we come out of this depends a lot on government policy. Certainly, monetary policy, as I mentioned, is already maxed out. Interest rates are zero. That's about all they can do that's going to be very effective. Fiscal policy, the federal government spending money, will depend on Congress appropriating it and the president signing it. Now, that has happened with some massive programs already, but the closer we get to the election, if our Congress follows what they've done in the past, they're going to be so tied up with that, nothing will get done until after November 3rd. And I hope that's not true, but I think it's likely that it will be difficult to get things through until the election. And that puts us basically in next year when the economy will need a major fiscal boost, but we'll have to wait and see what happens then. But the happy news, I think, is that the answer to that question is to some degree under our control, given a situation with the virus that is itself more under control. And about that, I have no worthwhile opinion at all.
So there's been, we talked about dairy supply chains, all supply chains here, and have exposed several processing bottlenecks in meat and dairy industries this year, resulting in some empty grocery store shelves. Are there USDA resources available to encourage growth in these industries or prevent some supply chain disruptions moving forward? I mean, those discussions might be in the early phases, but there are obviously some learning moments through this COVID-19 crisis.
Yeah, no, I think this is going to be an area that people look at. Places like the Ag Econ department at Cornell and others, where they're going to be doing some research looking at what response strategies are effective, are warranted. Certainly, we've seen large concentration in the U.S., for example, meat slaughter sector. Concentration certainly in dairy processing as well. I mean, setting up new infrastructure is pretty expensive, although, as Dr. Kyle mentioned, it's fairly cheap to borrow money right now. So I've heard of folks talking about more decentralized processing to more like Europe, for example, that would maybe insulate the U.S. sector from similar effects to either a fall impact. Obviously, building infrastructure takes some time, so fall is not that far away. But for maybe a future sectoral response, I've heard others talk about more movement towards robotics and higher intensification in those facilities to minimize the amount of actual labor that you need in the sector itself, which would also potentially insulate the processing sector from worker illnesses and absenteeism in the facilities. I think certainly one takeaway that we've learned from the spring is that having adequate protective measures for personnel on hand and not having a lack of that PPE material is certainly something that we can address now, stockpile that so that if something happens in the fall, we're more prepared than we were this spring.
Andy, I think we're going to send this question to you. It comes from one of our panelists that helped start this program here. I'll ask the question and then I'll put Mark's prelude in here, and that's Mark Stevenson. Just how bad a year will this be for dairy producers anyway? And he brings these pieces of information. We've experienced tremendous swings in future prices. It looks like 2020 prices won't be as bad as we thought they were just a few weeks ago. It really only may be one really bad quarter in 2020. Most producers received about $6.20 through the CFAP program for first quarter's production. If you enrolled at the $9.50 level for DMC, you'll receive maybe $3 for a quarter. And if you used Dairy RP back in the fourth quarter of 2019, you could be receiving significant payments as well. So for producers who used relatively accessible risk management, this is his ultimate question. For producers who had used relatively accessible risk management, just how bad a year will it be anyway?
Yeah, well, it's always really helpful if you get a tough question that also comes with the answer. So I think Mark really put his finger on a couple of things. One of the things that really struck me big time when I got my first job and I had a chance to look at Cornell's Dairy Farm Business Summary was what for me was an astonishing gap between the lowest performing group of farms and the highest producing group of farms. And I don't mean min to max, I mean like the lowest decile, 10%, the highest 10%. And that performance factor, like on net returns, was easily a factor of 2, maybe a factor of 3. And I think this year, that is just going to blow up even farther. If you're in a business that was highly leveraged, you've got some serious solvency problems, you didn't do anything to protect your price, you didn't sign up for DMC, which, oh, by the way, wasn't really such a crazy thing to not do at the end of 2019. You don't really like futures markets. You didn't want to get into dairy RP. Maybe you weren't as careful with your workforce as you ought to be. Oh my gosh, that's a scenario for some really negative returns. But as Mark pointed out, if you happen to be the guy who maxed out on DMC, going to get himself a nice direct payment from USDA, and maybe are a small enough size that you don't actually even max out on that, you cover all your production. You did dairy RP, or you're locked in a nice price with your co-op. Actually, those numbers would suggest you're probably going to have an up year. And so I think the answer to the question, how does the average dairy farmer do, is even more meaningless than it usually is, because it's going to be all over the place.
We're going to wrap up with this question, and I know I'm going to edit it a little bit on the fly here, but would dairy and other agricultural markets, but let's just say, would commodity markets see similar chaos as 2 months ago if states have to go in a lockdown again this fall due to COVID-19? So I think I'd like to hear from all our panelists, and you guys can decide who wants to go first on that one.
Well, I'll just take it from the macro point of view, that if there is a second wave and a more widespread lockdown, because let's remember, a lot of the country either never did lock down or didn't do it for all that long. And so a second one might well be a bigger and more all-inclusive. I would say all bets are off. I don't think people really know what that means, although there is evidence from the first lockdown of what industries might be in big trouble. But I think we're in for a wild ride yet again.
Rob or Andy?
Shot at that, Rob?
Yeah. No, I was going to say the same. It's hard to know, obviously, what it looks like in the fall, if there is a return of a fall wave, if you will, how widespread that is, whether it's an urban or a rural, or. But I do think we've learned some lessons from earlier this year that will help if that happens. Nevertheless, I totally agree with the way that prices react, and businesses will again be shuttered in large part. And I imagine that markets will reflect that, just like they did this spring.
The thing that I would add, in fact, there's just a whole bunch of things that I think this topic really starts to make you think about. One is, we're not really done with the first wave yet. So the data are a little tough, and we don't know that much about testing, and it's not all the states are reporting the numbers the same, and it's too bad we don't have better information. But clearly, the infection is kind of rolling in from the coast towards the center. And so we're still seeing first wave effects heading towards the more rural or less densely populated areas of the US. Same stories going on in the rest of the world. Africa and South America are relatively new to this. And oh, by the way, a lot of those are big food importing countries that are important customers to us, or who add some buoyancy to our export potential. So we're not even done with the first wave yet. If I had to bet, I'd bet there will be a second wave. But if that comes towards the end of the calendar year and then persists in through the winter, I think we also have to recognize the context is really different. You're at a point in the dairy cycle where production is declining, consumption is usually coming up. You're talking about Thanksgiving, Christmas, the third most important dairy holiday in the year, which is the Super Bowl. And you've got a lot of people that, want to get in a plane, go fly someplace, go see grandma, use a lot of butter, eat a lot of cheese with chips and whatnot at the parties. And if that all falls apart, ooh, that's a big time of the year where a lot of butter makers, a lot of cheese makers make all their profits. That could be even more tough than it is right now, where the biggest problem is we got a lot of milk coming on. You throw that into an international context, and that could be a pretty sad scenario. On the other hand, we are much more sophisticated in terms of dealing with this disease. We understand treatments better every day. Everybody's got a mask in a drawer somewhere, and even if it annoys you to put it on, it's not like you haven't heard that story before. So I think, we will be a little bit prepared if there is a second wave, but it's partly getting sick, but it's also partly where are we in the production cycle? in terms of crops that we've harvested. The big deal now for strawberries. It's going to be a hell of a lot bigger deal next fall for apples and cherries.
Well, this wraps up our dairy live stream episode. Our conversation will continue June 24th. I'd like to thank Jim Baltz at the University of Illinois for being our producer, to Maggie Gillis and Caitlin Allen on our editorial team for editing the questions as they came in. And most importantly, thank you to our guests this week here, Steve Kyle at Cornell University, Andy Novakovic at Cornell, and Chief Economist Rob Johansson at USDA. I really appreciate everyone on Dairy Livestream and our guests. And this is Corey Geiger, Managing Editor of Hordes Dairyman, signing off. So have a wonderful week, and thank you.